It's like we have this war going on between sugar being the worst mortal enemy and trans fats being the worst mortal enemy. Okay, we know that they both do some pretty detrimental things if we overconsume them. But if we have to look at what I think is really the hallmark of detriment to our body, inflammation, we have to look at the data, like what's happening within our body, which one is going to potentially trigger a stronger inflammatory response, and which one has more concrete evidence against it. So I'm going to break down both, and we'll kind of come to a conclusion here on which one I think is best to avoid. But full disclaimer, avoid both if you can. We don't need to have them in our diet, but I want to help you understand what's really going on and why things are doing what they're doing. So without further ado, let's break it down. After this video, check out Thrive Market to save 25% off your entire grocery order. I seriously mean that. So Thrive Market is an online grocery store, but they specialize in better for you options. So like if you go to, say, the regular grocery store, Thrive Market's going to have a lot of the foods that are at the grocery store, but they're also going to have ones that have been vetted in terms of like maybe they're gluten-free or reduced sugar or no sugar. They put things into a cool category like paleo or vegan or keto, or to make it easy to shop, and then it gets delivered to your doorstep in a couple days, and it's that easy. It's super simple, and that link down below, because they are a sponsor on this channel, saves you 25% off your grocery order, but also gets you a free gift when you use that link. So check out Thrive Market down below in the description after this video. So inflammation. This is what we're dealing with. Inflammation is a normal response within our body, okay? It gets a bad rap, but like if you were to fall down on your face, if your face didn't get swollen and inflamed, you'd have a problem. Nothing would heal, okay? If you didn't have inflammation after a workout, you wouldn't heal and your muscles wouldn't grow. We need it, but what happens is we live in a society today where we have so much stress, so much stuff, so much inbound, so much food, so much weird adulterated ingredients. We can sometimes have this overproduction of inflammatory cytokines, overproduction of inflammation, which can affect our DNA, affect our cells. So anyway, let's look at sugar first. When we look at sugar and refined carbs, we have to look at a study that was published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This was pretty interesting because it took a look at 47 diabetic people, say they were type 2 diabetic, and it had them consume 1 liter of sugary soda or 1 liter of milk, which has a fair bit of sugar in it, 1 liter of diet soda, or 1 liter of water. Well, I can bet my bottom dollar that the water one probably had a good outcome. But here's what's wild. When they looked at uric acid, and uric acid is a precursor to inflammation, only the soda with the sugar drove up uric acid. Now, they had a 15% increase in uric acid. That's a pretty significant increase, but uric acid it's somewhat correlational, but it has been demonstrated to drive up things like interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein. A lot of times what we'll notice is that when uric acid starts to ramp up, we see a correlation with inflammation ramping up at about the same linear rate. But the other piece that uric acid is interesting with is the world of insulin resistance. We also see that same kind of linear correlation with uric acid and insulin resistance. So there's a short-term effect of a 15% potential increase in uric acid that could drive up inflammation, but there's also the effect on insulin resistance, which could long-tail drive up inflammation for a longer period of time. If we're more insulin resistant, then we run into an issue with inflammation too. We also see from a study that was published in the journal Food and Function that when you have high amounts of fructose or high amounts of sucrose, high amounts of sugar in general, you have an increase in fatty deposits within the liver. Okay, we can also see that there is some correlation with necroinflammation where the liver becomes more inflamed. This could be driven by a number of different things, okay? If you're in a caloric surplus and this happens, it can probably be exacerbated. Let it be known that high amounts of saturated fat can also drive up a fatty liver. So it's not to say that sugar is only the culprit. There's multiple culprits here. But there's a lot of evidence that sugar can drive up adipokines, so it drives up the amount of inflammation that's secreted by fat cells. So if you have fat on you already, sugar could influence those fat cells to release more. Now let's take a look at trans fats, which I just really can't stand, because the thing with sugar, although I'm not a big fan of it, the thing with sugar is at least it's a little bit closer to being something that's natural. Maybe it's refined and ultimately like super filtered, but generally speaking, like I don't think people are getting super overweight from eating copious amounts of fruit or eating berries. Maybe it's not the best thing to do in the world, but it's not, I don't think fruit is a cause for the obesity epidemic, okay? So I have a mixed relationship with sugar. Now with trans fats are hydrogenated. They are literally made in a lab. They are literally where they take perfectly good fats and they add hydrogen to them to make them saturated. Right then and there, from a holistic approach, I feel like trans fats are already a bigger problem. Let's look at the data though. So there was a study that was published in the journal Nutrition that took a look at 730 women. It was observational to see what they would eat and how it would affect their inflammation. So they found that those that consumed the highest amount of trans fats had a 73% higher level of C-reactive protein compared to those that consumed the lowest amount of trans fats, 73%. Okay? And then there was a 17% increase in what's called interleukin-6, which in the world of what are called interleukins, inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-6 is usually considered like the worst. It's usually what we're really looking at. Interleukin-1 beta and interleukin-6, 17% increase from baseline there, from the lowest level. That's significantly larger than 6 months of consumption of a sugary beverage at 1 liter per day in the previous sugar group. So with that, it's like, okay, you can see that trans fats might be the bigger culprit here when it comes down to driving up inflammation. Now, C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 are very big risk factors when it comes down to cardiovascular disease. So again, we have this epidemic, right? We have obese people, we have cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and a lot of us are blaming it all on sugar. I do think that sugar is an issue, for sure, but I think if I had to look at like the last 30 years, I think the trans fats might even be a bigger problem. Fortunately, we're getting to the situation where trans fats are becoming a little bit less and less, but we still have things floating around like hydrogenated, peanut butter, and we still have things like margarine, and we still have things like vegetable shortening floating around that I really think we could do away with. Another thing that we know for sure is that C-reactive protein can influence atherogenesis, the actual formation of plaque. So anytime we're driving up that CRP, we are taking a risk. And that's why I usually recommend, okay, look at your CRP levels. Look at your lipid panel, look at all that stuff, but really pay attention to your CRP levels because it can be a pretty nasty risk factor. It can be a pretty nasty precursor. The other thing I want to make a note of when it comes down to trans fats is that trans fats have a very strong correlation with what is called VAT, V-A-T, our visceral adipose tissue. That is the fat that is underneath the visible body fat that surrounds our organs. It is the sole purpose of that visceral fat. Sounds weird that it even has a purpose, but it is that sole purpose to be able to ultimately have an inflammatory response to neutralize pathogens that come through our gut, that pass through our gut. In the seldom occasion that pathogenic bacteria or material passes through our gut and into the area outside of our gut, that visceral adipose tissue is just supercharged with inflammatory cytokines to be able to neutralize those pathogenic materials. Because when pathogens come in, we neutralize it with inflammation. Remember, inflammation is good, just not an overabundance of it. So that visceral adipose tissue has a purpose, but not in copious amounts. So if trans fats contribute to higher levels of visceral adipose tissue, then we at default are secreting more inflammatory cytokines. So it's not just about the impact of the food, it's about the secondary impact that it has as time goes on. And that's what we really need to be paying attention to. So I would say a double whammy is really that combination of sugary sodas and trans fats. Like the worst thing you could probably do is drink a regular soda along with a couple tablespoons of the lowest quality peanut butter. It's like that is an inflammation just mess waiting to happen. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel and I'll see you tomorrow.